Hello and welcome to September's All the Everything. Welcome. This is my first one back after my August break, albeit I did actually do an All the Everything show in August. So it's kind of a weird one. I have had a month's break other than doing that. Yeah, it's good to be back. It's good to be back. So, this month's topic, as chosen by our Facebook group members as ever, is one that, my goodness, is going to go way deeper than I ever expected when I first started pondering this topic. It is really going to be a big one. I've just come fresh out of the pre-show party that we hold in the Facebook group, so that I get the opportunity to actually just spend some time with our members talking about this topic before I start recording. And yeah, just in the, 20, 30 minutes we've been talking, again, I've seen so much more. It feels as though this is a conversation that one way or another, we're going to keep being in. And it's not the thing I really thought I'd be talking about. So it's an interesting one. So, as ever, I'm going to be talking about what I've been consuming, creating over the last month, and then I'll dive deep into that main topic of how to discover the real cause of anxiety and benefit from its hidden gift. I'm going to start with what I've been consuming, and I'm going to talk about two different books that I've been reading this month. One is a book that is actually one of my all-time favorite books. I first read it, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 5 years or so ago. And it was one of those books that has had an incredible influence and inspiration on my life and work since. It is an amazing book, absolute, like, just really, it's just really enjoyable to read. But what it's showing you, what it's allowing you to experience about our Indigenous heritage is, I don't have words to really express to you the power and the magic in it. It's incredible. The interesting thing was, even though I constantly mention this book, even though I often, I'm talking, at least a couple of times a month, will think about this book, when I've come back to reread it, it's like I've never read it before. It's so fresh. There's so much in it that I hadn't seen before. It's actually quite mind-blowing. It's like, is this even the same book? Just to say, it's just as good. It's just clearly that where I was then, there were different things that were standing out to me compared to now. So it's been incredibly, fascinating to reread. And it turns out to be, I didn't start rereading it for this reason, but the thing that's really magical about it is how well it aligns to this month's topic. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. So I'm going to hold why that is so connected to this month's topic when I get into it. But let's just say it's turned out to be perfect timing for me to reread it, because it has a lot to say on the topic of what we could say is mental health. The other book that I've only just started reading, and I previously listened to an audio version of it, and now I'm reading the book itself, and it's Magic Without Tears by Aleister Crowley. So any of you who are into magic, almost certainly, I mean, even if you're not into magic, you've probably heard of Aleister Crowley. He's pretty infamous, but certainly if you're into magic at all, you will have heard of him, and maybe either a fan of his work or loathe the man and his work. He's pretty divisive in that way. Magic Without Tears is a brilliant book. It's actually in the form of real letters that he wrote to a student. So they're very, I guess, human and natural and explanatory. So they're a delight to read, absolute delight to read. The thing that really hit me when I was reading it last night was the heart that was coming through. So again, if you know anything about Crowley, you'll know him as, he's called things like the wickedest man in England, the beast, has been, talked about as a Satanist and all sorts of things. An absolute monster. Crowley's I guess, expression into the world was to a large extent intentional, as in that was very much a creation of him as a magician. Um, and I guess there was a lot that wasn't based in reality, let's say. Anyway, put it all to one side. What really hit me when I was reading it last night, to the point where it actually brought me to tears, was just the kindness and the patience, the love that was in his words, the love of both magic, the love of his own will, the love of his students' will, his love of her. It was clear you don't actually get to see her letters to him, but you can tell she's kind of resisting the work and kind of trying to get into like intellectual games rather than just allowing herself to be in the unknown. And you can really see his love for the way her shadow is kind of getting in the way and stopping her from doing the work. So it was just such this, everything that's been said about this man, and all of, while some of it isn't true, he very much was a drug addict. He very much has probably done things that most of us would deem not particularly savory. And yet there was just real purity, this just divine masculine showing up in his teachings, in his words to this student. So if you haven't read it before, I would say go read it. You can get it, as cheap as anything on Kindle. And there's also, and I've shared this previously, and I'll pop this in the show notes, there's actually a version where it's being read on YouTube. You can go and check out as well if you prefer to listen to things audio. So that's Magic Without Tears. I would really recommend checking it out, even and especially if you've always had this sense of like, oh, Aleister Crowley, no. Okay, so moving on to what I've been creating in the last month. And it's been a really interesting one on the topic of creativity. And I won't actually go in detail to this because I share the one thing that I have created was a shamanic download on the topic of creativity. I haven't created all that much else, and I explain why in that particular show. So I'll make sure we link to it in the show notes. But in a nutshell, I actually saw a lot about my let's say shadowy addictive patterns around creativity, and so I intentionally took a pause. I intentionally have been creating much less than I typically do. So yeah, there's something quite meta in the fact that one thing I created was something about creativity, and also something about why I hadn't been creating. So that's been my month. It's actually been a very interesting experience for me on the topic of creativity, which is something that is so dear to my heart, which is obviously why I talk about it pretty much every month. So I won't say any more because I'll just be repeating what I actually do say in that shamanic download. But if you are interested in that topic, and what I've seen about it, specifically that shamanic download, I talk about how creative expression links to community and soul. So I'd really recommend checking that out if that's something that speaks to you. Okay, into the big one now, into the topic of how to discover the real cause of anxiety and benefit from a hidden gift. I'm going to take a pause because I've been now talking for 40 minutes. I'm about to do a whole lot more talking. So I just want to center myself back into my body and into my heart before I launch in. And I will say at the outset, this is definitely going to get into some pretty complex and deep areas. And so allow yourself to take in whatever's for you. It may be that there's going to be three main areas I'm going to talk to, and it might be that all three right now aren't relevant to you. That's perfect. Take what you need from it. Don't worry if the kind of wider framework I'm talking about is just too much to take in or hold in your mind at the moment. Really trust that you will take what you need to take from it. And again, I don't think I've said this in the show. I think I said it in the pre-show party to the group. Because there's so much here that I'm going to talk about, I won't be able to go in depth into each area. If you've got questions, if you would like to go deeper into any of these areas, do let us know, because there's probably resources we've already created that go deeper into that area. And I'm really happy to create more if it's something we haven't already spoken about. It feels as though this is something that, of course, right now, fear is so up in the collective. And whether or not we're calling it anxiety or fear, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a moment, my goodness, if there was ever a time where this is relevant, it's now. So if there's anything I can do to illuminate this, to help you take steps along the path that's right for you, I would love to know that. So just do let me know. Okay, so there is a definition that I'm going to play with here and invite you to just hold loosely, because we're going to have our own kind of fixed idea about anxiety, particularly if you've actually been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And so my invitation here is to hold it a little bit more loosely so that you're able to take more from this conversation. So the definition we're going to work with is partly taken from dictionary definitions, and then I'm going to add a bit more to it. So it's a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease about something with an uncertain outcome. And what I would like to offer is a modern word, as a modern creation, this idea of anxiety. And it's actually a modern word for a way that fear shows up. Ultimately, it's fear. And it's a specific way that we've named and experienced in this modern world, which is typically associated with it showing up in a chronic way over a period of time. It's showing up over a lot of our day, and is often in ways that isn't necessarily rational. Typically, when we name something as anxiety, it's because we know that whilst it may not be obvious to the moment, there is part of us that knows that we're experiencing in a way that doesn't necessarily match the actual threat that we're feeling anxious about. So as we go through this show, I'll probably use the word anxiety and fear fairly interchangeably for that reason. And I hope that makes sense to you. Please recognize that, again, at its heart, anxiety is fear. And so it's kind of irrelevant in some ways, whether we look at it as fear or anxiety. It's just that really at the deepest level, we're going to be talking about it's fear. And so being able to recognize that is going to be helpful. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the real cause of anxiety and the gift. And I can start with the cause really, really simply. We're going to talk a bit more about it, and the gift we'll get to at the end. So as far as I see it, there are actually 3 causes of anxiety. And all of these I'd say, play a part in the creation of anxiety. Simply put, they are a lack of connection with spirit, soul, and sovereignty. It may look nothing like that. You may hear me say it's a lack of spirit, soul, and sovereignty and just be like, what? That's not what's going on. I'll explain a bit more why I see that's the case, but I just wanted to almost like give you that at the outset. That's what I see is at the heart of anyone that's experiencing anxiety. And as ever, I typically start these shows by looking at this through a wild lens. So if humans are in the wild, if we're in an indigenous setting, as was the case for humans through the vast majority of our time here on the planet, what would it look like there? And the interesting thing is, and talking about, again, the book Original Wisdom that I mentioned that I'd been rereading, as it happens, when we look at I'm not going to say all indigenous cultures, but I'm going to say, the vast majority that have been studied, we typically don't see this pandemic, weird word to use these days, pandemic of modern mental health conditions. We don't see this incredibly large percentage of people struggling with things like anxiety and depression. It just isn't the case. I'm not going to say it's absolutely not ever present, but what I will say is it certainly is not present in anything remotely like we see in today's culture. That tells you something, doesn't it? Specifically in the book Original Wisdom, is fascinating because he's looking at it through that lens. The author is, I believe, a psychologist, and so he's very specifically looking at it through that lens. And it just, again, it was struck him how, again, talking about anxiety specifically, just isn't something that was experienced. It wasn't this commonplace experience that it is for us today in this modern culture. I believe that goes back to what I was just saying, is because this modern cultural lack of spirit, soul, and sovereignty is not happening in an indigenous setting. When we're in the wild, when humans are wild, we have a deep connection. Even the word connection isn't quite doing it justice, but we are like saturated in spirit, soul, and sovereignty. So again, there's going to need to be a bit of you taking my word for it at this stage, and I'm hoping, again, as we explore this more, you're going to start to see why what I'm saying actually does resonate, does have some truth. But we can see what we're lacking in this modern world is creating this fearful way of being, where modern health issues, and specifically anxiety, are so common when we're in an indigenous setting, when we have this just absolute again, connection doesn't quite do it justice, but we have spirit, soul, and sovereignty as just a way of being. We don't see anxiety in anything remotely to the same degree that we do in this modern culture. I'm going to share a brief bit about my chair's noisy, brief bit about my own experience with anxiety, because it's really important for me that you understand that when I'm speaking about these things, this isn't something where I'm looking at people and with no understanding of what they're going through. I have experienced actually extreme panic attacks and such chronic anxiety, such bad anxiety. I believe it's what resulted in me having chronic facial pain. So I really am speaking from embodied experience when I'm talking about all of these things, and also what I've seen in terms of the causes and the gifts. Again, very much personal experience. So whilst I could definitely go back and tell you experiences with, I don't know, feeling anxiety or nervousness about specific things before then, my journey really with anxiety started with a traumatic event in my 20s, which I'm not going to go into the detail of right now. I have in the past, but it's just not relevant right now for this show. So experienced a traumatic event, and shortly after that started to experience panic attacks, like humongous panic attacks, and this just ever-present anxiety where I just did not feel safe. And I guess that lack of safety was also what created the panic attacks, as in I already didn't feel safe, and then if something came into my experience that felt like extra unsafe, it would result in a panic attack. And as I said already, I believe, and this will make more sense when I share the next part, I believe the anxiety is what created the chronic facial pain. So I experienced that for, I think, something like 15 years. It was a long time where anxiety was a very frequent visitor in my life. Then, going back, I think 7, 8 years ago, and again, I won't go into details on this because I've shared about this on the show before as well. I had what some might describe as an enlightenment experience, where I suddenly saw the nature of thought. I suddenly saw the nature of my experience in a way that I've never seen before. And it happened in a way that was so deep and so spontaneous. It resolved that chronic, ongoing low level of anxiety and the panic attacks like that. So they just went. And so it was like to a miracle level. I mean, I literally did think I'd found the answer to life. Everyone needs to know about this. This is incredible. And so remember that as I talk through these different aspects that I see are missing from people's lives, I'm never knocking that experience, because if for me it was profound, absolutely profound, the difference it made in my life. It really was like going from being in prison to being free. It's only as time's gone on, I've realized like, oh, it was like I was let out of prison, but I was then in the prison yard. I just didn't know, because compared to being in prison, it just felt so much better. So over the years, I've really had the opportunity to see the way that anxiety, fear still shows up in my life, but now in specific ways. When it comes to specific choices, specific events in my life, it's still showing up, but it now means something different. And so that's what I'm going to share a bit more about in a moment. So let's dive into those three things. And some of the things I'm going to talk about, I would have talked about to death on this show before. And my intention really now is to not go over old ground, but really link this into why this matters when it comes to anxiety. So the first area is what I typically call the path of ascension. Sometimes people call it as sort of transcension, I guess, forms of spirituality. But really is that way of experiencing ourselves as being really conscious and guided by spirit, having unity with everything. And obviously there's degrees that will experience that sometimes, like certainly in that moment where I had that kind of enlightenment moment, it just felt like, wow, I've been blasted wide open. Sometimes it's more subtle, and of course it comes and goes unless someone really has had, which I think is fairly rare, an entirely kind of just been moved into enlightenment being their constant state. Most of us are going to kind of be in and out of that sense of awareness of having a connection or being part of all that is. How this specifically relates to anxiety is when that happens, we have this relief from that association with the small self, with that thinking part of us. So when we have no awareness that we're part of all there is, we believe we are our thoughts. We believe we are this small self that is separate from everything and needs to protect itself. So, of course, from there, it's going to be a really fearful existence. When we have, and again, whether this is an ongoing, walking a path, or whether we have like a moment like I had, when we experience ourselves as something much bigger, something that is connected to everything, whether we want to call that God consciousness or spirit or non-duality, oneness, whatever you want to call this, we experience ourselves no longer as this separate small self. So, of course, that is going to provide relief. We're going to generally feel more peaceful, more connected, more calm. So it is an incredibly beneficial, important, and I'd even say essential experience or understanding, connection, whatever way you want to describe it, for us to live here fully as humans. So everything I'm saying, whether or not you've already traveled this path, and I know many of our listeners have come from a path of non-duality or the three principles, believe me when I say I am no way whatsoever knocking that path. again, for me, it made such a difference, like a miracle level of difference. And I really do believe that having an experience of ourselves as having this deep connection with everything really allows us to travel more fully into the other path. So this is a really important aspect in terms of us experience ourselves in a way that isn't this kind of small, scared, anxious self. And even if we've traveled that path to a very large degree, and I'd say I'm someone that did and still is, we likely will have fear still showing up in certain places. Whether we call that anxiety, whether we call it fear, again, kind of irrelevant. They're the same thing. We will likely still have fear showing up in certain places. And then the interesting thing that's happened is we've had this disassociation from self, from our thoughts. But what that can result in is also a dissociation from the part of us that can be autonomous and responsible. This part of us that, whether you want to call it ego, whether you want to call it the kind of human part of us, we've had a dissociation ourselves from that too. We then can be saying things like, it's all in God's hands, or I just need to surrender to the flow. And we're not recognizing there's actually a part of us that we're completely innocently bypassing, disassociating from, that is a really important aspect to these three parts I'm saying cause anxiety. I'll say more about that in a moment. The other thing is, because we've had this disassociation from this part of us that's unique, and you could say separate, although, you know, separation is also an illusion, but hey, let's just say a separate experience. That means, again, there is real value that's come from that, but it also means we've had a dissociation from shadow and soul. So we are so sold on this: there is no me, there's no separate self, there is just consciousness, there is just awareness. We don't then have this association with these other parts of us that would allow us to live this full and open experience here on earth. And so, going back to what I said at the beginning, if we see that anxiety is caused by three things: a lack of spirit, soul, and sovereignty, the ascension path gives us that connection to spirit. What we then need is the connection to sovereignty and soul. And so, can you hear from what I've just said, that disassociation that's created by the ascension path, which is so beneficial because it gives us the experience of spirit, then almost like doubled down on creating a dissociation from what's needed to create sovereignty and what's needed to create connection to soul. So that's why the other two parts of the path are needed. So we'll talk about sovereignty first. And this is the part of us that allows us to lead the direction of our life, to be in our power, to have elevation. And the elevation part's really important, specifically when it allows us to move more powerfully and clearly into the last part we're going to talk about in a moment. Allows us to have choice, allows us to make choices that are free from conditioning and external circumstances. So this is really what we would term, if we were looking at it in an indigenous way, that maturation into like true adulthood that allows us to stand as someone who is able to be interdependent with others, that has this strong sense of self in a healthy way, in a mature way, and is able to work in an interdependent way with the rest of that community. When we walk the path of sovereignty, that's what allows us to create that elevation, when we can be above these conditioned ways of thinking and being that allow us to make choices, both in terms of doing the work and also to be able to take the aligned actions on what we see. So this is, again, I see such a vital part of the path. We, some people are fortunate enough to be able to walk the path of ascension and the path of descension, but don't have the opportunity to walk the path of sovereignty. And again, I'm hoping it's becoming clear now, all three paths are essential. They all help us walk the others, I would say actually more fully. So this again is that work, and I love the way Bill Plotkin talks about this. He talks about it actually as a maturation of ego. So the word ego is often talked about in spiritual terms as like a bad thing, like we need to get rid of the ego, not associate with the ego. And again, when we look at this in a wild way, it's actually about becoming adult, becoming someone who is able to respond. And again, this funny enough came up last month about how we can talk about this as if like being a child is wrong. Being a child when you are a child is perfect. Being able to have a childlike aspect of ourselves as an adult is perfect and gorgeous and wonderful and necessary for full life. Being childish, being immature as an adult will be really limiting. It will really get in the way of being in our power and being able to make choices and have elevation. And I think it probably goes without saying why that is going to cause anxiety, because if you don't have freedom to make choices, you are at the mercy of the world. You are at the mercy of what the outside world, I mean, you can see this at the moment, regardless what your personal thoughts are, beliefs are, choices are around what's showing up at the moment in our collective. My goodness, if you don't have sovereignty right now, you are going to be experiencing so much more anxiety than if you have sovereignty. And I'm talking about as if it's binary. Of course it isn't, but let's talk about it in degrees. Right now, the more sovereign you are, the less anxiety you're going to have about what's showing up in the collective, because you're going to be so much more aware of both how your shadow is playing out. You're going to be able to be so much more aware of the places you're closing from your connection to all that is. And you're going to be so much more aware of how you still have choices. Okay, now moving into the final part of the path, which is the descent, or the final path of the three, the descent. And this is the path that allows us to have that connection to soul that I said is one of the vital three things that we need the connection to. And when it's lacking, causes anxiety. So descent is the way that we go deep into this part of us that's unique, that came here to this planet with a certain, for a certain reason, for a certain role. So the descent allows us to deepen into our soul, into our deepest truth, align ourselves with the expression of our unique gifts. And the way that we do that is to do the work to integrate those parts of us that are in shadow that stop that. So this is something that we've seen through the work that we've done with people is so much more available if we have already, or also at the same time, walking the path of ascension. This creates a safety net's not quite the right metaphor, because typically you need a safety net if you're going up and you're jumping down. So I suppose you could say it's a bit like an oxygen tank if you're diving, or a guide rope. These, having that connection to all that is, really does provide this sense of safety to then descend. We don't feel alone. We don't feel that we are this separate little self journeying down into the chasm alone. So having that opportunity for a connection to spirit is something that really allows us to descend more deeply and fully. So this is again how these things all play out together. It's just so beautiful. We don't need to, thankfully, choose only one of these three paths. They all have a place, and they all actually interplay in a beautiful way. The path of sovereignty is really important, because from sovereignty, we then have this sense of autonomy and power that means that we don't, let's say, over identify with what we discover in shadow. if we see, and I'm not going to have time to like really go in depth into shadow at the moment, but simply put, it's those parts of us that through wounding, we've shoved away. So they're not in our awareness, and they're not something that we believe other people are going to be aware of. So these are these parts of us that are hidden away and are then having this influence on us in unconscious ways. The quote that I probably said more than any other quote ever, Jung's, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. I'll probably paraphrase that as ever as well. This is what he's talking about when he, in that particular quote primarily, until we make what is in shadow conscious, it will direct our life and we will call it fate, because it is powerful. These are parts of ourselves that are as powerful as hell and are working, really, you could say, against us. They have their own mission. They're there to try and keep us safe. They're a part of us that's been seen as unwelcome. I'm just going to give an example off the top of my head. It could be that we were told as a child that we're too much, we're too loud, we're too attention seeking. Almost certainly one of the things I experienced. And we shove that part of ourselves away into shadow so it can no longer hurt ourselves or others. So we no longer experience that lack of approval from others. So it's still there. That part of us can't actually be destroyed. It then acts away in shadow and creates typically two ways that it shows up, two ends of the shadow pole. So if that part of us has been shoved in shadow, is the one I described, that kind of need to be in the spotlight, to have people's eyes on us. And again, I am speaking personally, it is an aspect of me. It will typically show up in one of two shadowy ways. Either will be really kind of like up to points, like attention grabbing, attention seeking, wanting to be the center of attention in ways that aren't particularly serving for ourselves and others, or we're hiding away. We're like trying to not draw attention to ourselves. And again, it feels off because there's parts of all of us that can sense who people really are. And so if you have someone, again, like me, who part of my soul is here to have people's eyes on me as a teacher, let's say, when I'm hiding away, it isn't experienced in a natural way for other people. They actually experience in a way where, and this is where people have said things to me like I'm snobby and up myself and I seem like I'm too good to talk to people, because it doesn't feel right. It feels as though I should be someone that's taking up space. And when I'm not, it doesn't come across that I'm just a quiet person or I'm just actually quite content sitting in the background. It comes across in this weird way that is compelling me to hide, but isn't landing in a natural way for other people. And this is true no matter what the thing is. So whatever we have pushed into shadow, it's going to have its own mission that's going to influence our behavior in these ways. When I say these ways, not the way I just described it, in its own way, in a shadowy way. So the work is to illuminate what's in shadow. How this applies, going back to fear, going back to anxiety, when we have already or are simultaneously walking the path of ascension and walking the path of sovereignty, we are then in a position where we can notice these places that we are really seeing fear show up and recognize, this isn't saying stop. This isn't saying bypass or numb, or I should just tell myself that I'm feeling my thinking. This is actually a signpost to what is for me. And again, this is why having that connection with spirit and the connection with sovereignty are so important, because we then start to have that sense of connection and elevation that allows us to illuminate these places that is still showing up in a way that actually is meaningful. When we're still in reaction to the whole world, when we find everything scary, it's really only illuminating. There's, we need to do our work everywhere. Well, we've started to get this connection to spirit. We've started to rise into sovereignty. When we're having these places that fear show up, it's actually saying to us, have a look. Here lies material for my liberation. Because it's illuminating what's in shadow, which means it's actually a part of our soul. And typically, I mean, you could say, well, all parts of our soul are valuable. Absolutely. I mean, who doesn't want all parts of their soul kind of here and able to be used in conscious ways? The really interesting thing about those parts of us that are held in shadow are typically, they are our greatest gifts. I'm going to pause there and let that sink in. So the reason, going back right to the point of this show, the way that anxiety can be this hidden gift is it is pointing you to these parts of you that are a gift. So the anxiety itself is a hidden gift in that it's saying to you, this way is your gift. Go this way and uncover this part of you, this gold that's been held in shadow. So I'm just going to take a breath. How long have I been going for? Okay, so I do need to start to wrap this up soon. So I'm going to just name some of the ways that we are going to see this show up. And this is partly influenced by the things that were shared in the pre-show party in the Facebook group. But it can seem, and again, from the place where we are generally quite anxious, it's going to be really hard to see this as a gift. And again, if that is your experience, if a lot of your experience is anxiety, it likely means there is a real need to have that sense of connection to spirit. I would say in general, when people are experiencing a high level of anxiety, it's because they are feeling separate and small and scared and disconnected. And again, if we were to say, okay, we'll just throw everything at the ascension path, we're really missing the role of sovereignty and soul. So I always say, all three are needed. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to walk all three at once, but in some ways, you can. So, if you're feeling called to do that. But when you started to notice there's some commonalities in the places that you are experiencing anxiety, and someone in the Facebook group shared that there was a clear link between their sensitivity and their anxiety, that is a great example of where it's shining a light on one of your gifts. So I spoke a few months ago about differences in superpowers, and did another show also with Lucy Pierce talking about neurodivergence. These specific ways when we're noticing that we are really anxious in ways that really seem very connected to the fact we're very sensitive, typically that's where our sensitivity, and this can be often when people describe themselves as sensitive, it's actually sensitive in many ways at once. It's often we can be sensitive in a spiritual way, emotional way, a physical way, probably a mental way, and certainly an energetic way. And if that's been told or shown to us when we were younger that it's not welcome, and typically people that are sensitive, and I'm certainly a person that's a sensitive soul myself, if we've been told that we're overly sensitive, that we are like reacting too much, or we're too fussy about, for me, I could list a long list of things that I'm fussy about, that I'm sensitive to, whether it be lighting, temperature, fabrics on my skin, you name it. When we've been told in one way or another that we're too sensitive, of course, that will get shoved in shadow, but it doesn't go away. And it doesn't go away because it's actually here as part of the gift that you are to the world. So the more that we are able to be in real awareness, and again, this is again where the sovereign elevation helps, when we're able to look at these ways that shadow is saying to us, this is something to be scared of, this is something that's not welcome, this is something we need to hide. Notice that's happening and illuminate that happening, illuminate that pattern, illuminate that shadow. It starts to lose its power on us. That is, a big part of this work of illumination and integration of our shadow is start to just become aware of it. We start to become aware of it, it starts to lose its grip on us. It no longer owns us in the same way. So start to notice what is showing up for you on this regular basis, what patterns of fear are showing up in your body, in your life, in your awareness. And as you do so, I can't say this strongly enough, there will always be a gift there. I have never seen it any other way. And probably what I'm about to say is also true. The deepest shadow actually holds our greatest gifts. So I really want that invitation to be loud and clear to you when you are looking at the ways that shadow is creating this fear. Really look to see the gold that's held there. Notice the ways that, for example, sensitivity is actually part of the gift you came here to be. Typically, I notice those of us with sensitivities, we have come here as some kind of, whether you want to describe it as the magician archetype, we've come here as a medicine man, a woman, a healer, whether again in an indigenous setting it would be a shaman, whether it's a witch. Typically those of us are sensitive. This is actually part of our gifts, to be here and create these experiences of healing, of integration for others. And we cannot walk as this expression of our soul that we came here to be without reclaiming those parts of us. It just can't happen. Okay. Is there anything else I want to say? I think that's everything I want to say about those three parts. And I hope I've managed to illuminate both, again, why I see the causes of anxiety being those three causes, and also how it can be a gift. And I appreciate the dissension path in particular is a really hard path to walk. It is the one that typically brings the most pain. It brings us face to face with those parts of us that are wounded, are small and scared. And it really isn't an easy path to walk. It isn't an easy path to choose to walk. And again, that's why it's so important to have also the again, whether we call it a safety net or, oxygen tank, and the power and autonomy that come from ascension sovereignty, to have those alongside us so that we can choose into the path of dissension in a way that's actually going to be serving. And one final part on that also, in a way that's going to be serving, and also means that we don't just collapse into the wound. What can happen if we don't have particularly sovereignty in place? And I see this when people do, for example, inner child work or shadow work without a really strong focus also on sovereignty, is we can become really identified with what we find in shadow. So we can become really identified with our inner child. We can become really identified with those wounded parts of us. And of course, that's just going to keep us stuck there. So this is, again, why the sovereignty piece is so important if we're going to walk fully into that ascension path. Okay. I would love to know what you've taken from this show and what aligned actions you are going to take. And I guess the place to start first is to take a really honest look at those paths you've walked already. Have you walked the ascension path? Have you walked the sovereignty path? Have you walked the dissension path? Perhaps you're some way along all three of them. Perhaps you can say, do you know what? I've really gone a long way in terms of ascension, but I've only really, just sort of took the first step or two in terms of sovereignty or dissension. Just be really honest with yourself. Again, and even if you're listening to this and you don't experience anxiety, I imagine you experience fear because you're human. And so again, I really want you to look at this more broadly. If you feel as though, well, anxiety isn't true for me anymore, be honest, where is fear showing up? Because again, I'd be amazed if it isn't. So yeah, which of those three paths have you already walked? And what aligned actions are you going to take to walk further or even begin the paths that you haven't yet? And if you would like our support in doing that, these three paths are woven into everything we do with Waking the Wild for fairly obvious reasons now, I hope by this point. And so if you are feeling called to walk deeper into those paths, the 2 ways coming up that I would recommend you checking out are Waking the Wild Sovereign, which begins in November. And there are a few spaces left for that. And that's at primalhappiness.co/sovereign. Or, and this is particularly for those people who I described earlier as being the ones that are a bit more sensitive, being the ones that came here to be the medicine men and women, then Waking the Wild Medicine would be for you. And that's at primalhappiness.co/medicine. And that one, so I think it's fairly obvious by the names what they're about. So Waking the Wild Sovereign is very specifically has the focus of becoming this king or queen you came here to be. So it includes all those three paths, but the focus is on that king or queen archetype being fully actualized in your soul path. Waking the Wild Medicine, again, is very specifically for those people who came here to create change, to create healing for other people. And so that is, again, includes all three aspects of these paths because everything we do does, but very specifically it's for those people who have come here with that extra sensitivity for a reason. And of course, we really are happy to talk to you. If you're feeling the call to either one of them, have questions, do let us know. Okay, and if you are listening here on the podcast and aren't in our group, it's really worth coming and joining. As I say, we just had the pre-show party and I go live into the group every month, and also you get a chance to vote on it, all the rest of it, and that's at facebook.com/group/primalhappiness. If you want to see what else we're offering, again, primarily at the moment it's sovereign and medicine, but if you want to go and check out all of what we offer, that's at primalhappiness.co/go deeper. And if you are watching this either on Facebook or on YouTube, you can catch us on the podcast at primalhappiness.co/podcast. I think that's everything. Anyway, I would love to know, what did you take from the show? Have you got any questions for me? Is there anything you would like to hear me go deeper on? Please do let me know. And as ever, I'd say the Facebook group is probably the best place to let me know. Or if you just want to reach out to us directly via email, the best email is probably support@primalhappiness.co. Thank you so much for joining me, particularly if you've managed to join me live. I so appreciate it. And you, lots of love. Mwah. See you soon.